Carry on campers, welcome to this year's great debate which delves into how we got here, how it all began, and we're not talking about the birds and the bees. This year's topic is evolution versus creation. Has that Rockefeller indoctrination camp fooled us once again? Has it pulled the wool over our eyes? Did we evolve from a single-cell organism as we were once told? Are our great ancestors, were there once fish? Imagine though if it was. You'd have a great-great-great-great-great-great-granddad trout somewhere along the line. How do you feel about that?
Would we have fish and chips on Friday?
It wouldn't be so bad though. You wouldn't have to worry about what clothes to shop for, buy, what to wear, your hair to fix, and you wouldn't need to worry about lip filler because you're already sporting the trout pouch. I've got a little thing I want to say to you, which I found off the internet. Some of you might have heard of it. Christians call it prayer, spiritualists call it manifestation, witches call it spells, atheists call it the placebo effect, scientists call it quantum physics. Everyone's arguing over its name, no one is denying its existence. We are magical beings with a great power, and the cleaner we live, the greater our power is. So please remember that. Brent and Ian, thank you for joining us for this debate. It's a delight to have you here. Brent Holloway will be going into depth about evolution, and Ian will be delving into intelligent design, or creation, as we call it. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, please give a warm welcome to our great debaters for the Carry On Camping's Great Debate of 2024.
Hello all, thanks for coming. So I don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to crack straight on. So, the origin of life, is it best explained by evolution or intelligent design? Well, the first thing that you need to understand is that evolution doesn't cover the origin of life. So here's a quote. Well, first of all, actually, let me break down evolution. Evolution, all life having evolved from a single common ancestor by an unguided process of natural selection acting on random mutations. And then intelligent design in a nutshell. Certain features of the universe and of living things are best explained by an intelligent cause. So as I mentioned a moment ago, evolution doesn't deal with the origin of life. So this is a quote from Richard Dawkins, and he's talking about evolution and natural selection. It can't start until you've got genetics. Now he's talking about the distant past, when there were molecules bumbling around and self-replicating molecules that made copies of themselves came into existence by sheer luck. So they're not saying that evolution explains the start of life, how it first started. It comes down to sheer luck. And the reason that Richard Dawkins, the world's most famous atheist and evolutionist, the reason he's saying that you need genetics first for evolution to start is because you need genetics, you need the genetic mutations for natural selection to select to drive the evolution forward. So first of all, you have to have genetics come about by pure chance. So genetics, just to put it into context, vastly more complex than your mobile phones, and you're asked to believe that that came about by pure chance. So I'm going to talk a bit about the fossil record. So the Cambrian explosion, otherwise known as Darwin's dilemma, very few people I ever met have heard of the Cambrian explosion. They must have skirted over that when we were at school. So the reason it was called Darwin's dilemma, the Cambrian explosion is basically the abrupt appearance of animal life in the fossil record. Most of the phyla that exist today appear during the Cambrian explosion. So phyla, if you take all life that exists today, you can break it into 32 groups, and those 32 groups are called phyla. And inside each of those groups, the animals all share a basic body plan. So so one animal in one phyla will have a completely different body plan to an animal in another phyla. So at the beginning of the fossil record, Darwin's prediction would be that you'd find a very simple animal life that slowly, gradually would evolve to what we've got today. But in fact, the fossil record begins with the complexity and the same amount of diversity that we have now. So it's a complete contradiction to Darwin's theory. The animals appear fully formed, they're highly complex. The trilobite, one of the most famous fossils on Earth, they had compound eyes like modern insects do, and they appear at the very beginning of the fossil record, yet you're being asked to believe that your eyes evolved by random mutations over millions and millions of years. So obviously animals appearing with eyes complete at the beginning is a problem for Darwinism. There's no precursors. So if you've got that amount of diversity at the beginning of the fossil record, similar diversity to what we have now, there must have been billions and billions of animals that existed before that for those animals to be there, to have evolved into so simpler forms of those animals. They don't exist. And 150 years after Darwin's died, they still haven't been found. So here's a quote from Richard Dawkins. "We find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution the very first time they appear. It is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history." This is Wikipedia, a terrible source if you want the truth about something, but a great source if you want, you know, the mainstream view on something. So they're talking about the Cambrian explosion, when a sudden radiation of complex life occurred, and practically all major animal phyla, so all major body plans, started appearing in the fossil record. This, they say, is about between 500 and 600 million years ago this occurred, the Cambrian explosion. So it's hard to see the slide, but this is what Darwin would have predicted. On the left you've got a very simple form. I've used Lego pieces. So on the left you've got a very simple, small Lego piece. So ideally, to prove evolution, you'd want that simple form appearing in the fossil record, and then the animals that come after that to all bear a resemblance to it. You'd want to see a very gradual development. That's what evolution is. It's supposed to be gradualism. It's supposed to be very slow. That's what we would expect to see. This is what we see. I know it's hard to see, but it's a completely diverse group of animals, with, as I said earlier, with completely different body plans. So another way of looking at it, if you can see this slide, that white line, this is Darwin's prediction that over time that line would slowly creep up as more and more phyla evolved into life. This is a more accurate description of our fossil record. You've got this very sudden burst where it goes straight up, and that's the Cambrian explosion. So hopefully I'm emphasising this is a complete contradiction to what we're being told is the truth. This is another quote from arguably one of the world's most famous paleontologists, Stephen Jay Gould. "The Cambrian explosion was the most remarkable and puzzling event in the history of life." That's quite a profound comment for a paleontologist to be making about the fossil record. Here's another quote from Stephen Jay Gould. "The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology." So if you look at the fossil record, there should be billions and billions of transitions. Evolutionists would tell you about a handful of transitions, but there should be billions as animals slowly morph into other animals. But that doesn't appear. That's not there. So Charles Darwin, this is Charles Darwin himself, so he even acknowledged that this was a massive problem for his theory. "The abrupt manner in which whole groups of species suddenly appear in certain formations has been urged by several paleontologists as a fatal objection to the belief in the transmutation of species. If numerous species have really started into life all at once, the fact would be fatal to the theory." And unfortunately that is what the fossil record shows, that there's this abrupt, it's not just the Cambrian explosion. If you guys look into this further, you'll find out the Cambrian explosion is the largest of them, but it continued to happen, this abrupt appearance of fully formed animals appearing in the fossil record with no precursors, no simpler forms of them. So a quick slide on what are called living fossils. So on the left, you can't see it, it's a big fish, it's huge. It's called a coelacanth. And it was thought that this animal went extinct about 80 million years ago. It appears in the fossil record 400 million years ago. But it was discovered alive, swimming off the coast of South Africa, with no discernible difference from the fossil record. So you've got an animal that appears in the fossil record, supposedly 400 million years ago, but with no change. And this is in an article you can find online, livescience.com. This is just 4. There are many more so-called living fossils. The horseshoe crab, 300 million years old. The nautilus, 500 million years old. The cockroach, 300 million years old. No evolution. So they explain it as saying, well, other animals evolved, but those ones, for whatever reason, just didn't. So I'm going to talk quickly about natural selection. So there's a video online you'll find, I urge you to watch it. Richard Dawkins, and the title of the video is called "What's the Good of Half a Wing?" So he's attempting to explain how wings evolved. Now, it's going to be almost impossible for you to see this, but I'll try and explain what's there. He took a glass bauble that you'd hang on a Christmas tree, and he added 4 legs to it with pipe cleaners like you'd use when you was at play school. And he supposed that this was an animal, this is all coming from his imagination, this isn't science, this is an animal that existed in the distant past before wings had even evolved. And this animal's life cycle, presumably for millions of years, was being chased up trees by predators and jumping to either its death or breaking a neck or whatever, but to its detriment jumping because it didn't have wings. So it had this environmental pressure, this animal, because it's forever running up trees and having to jump from predators, that it required a pair of wings. So in this video, Dawkins takes these glass baubles with the 4 legs, and then he shows you, to the left, you can probably see it now, to the left he shows you an evolved version of that animal that's now started evolving wings, and he calls them wing stubs. Now if you can see it, it looks almost like a flying saucer. It's got this huge ring around the actual animal, and that ring is like a web between the legs, and it goes out to half the length of the legs. And then what he does, he drops the evolved one with the wing stub, as he calls it, and the one without the wing stub, and the one with the wing stub survives and the other one smashes, and he's very proud of himself, and he's making the argument now, I've just proved how wings evolve. But this is the fundamental problem with natural selection, why it's completely flawed. So Darwin wrote this in The Origin of Species: natural selection can act only by the preservation and accumulation of infinitesimally small inherited modifications, each profitable to the preserved being. Now, if I go back, again, it's not the greatest, you can't see it terribly well, but on the left, that wing stub that he's added to that animal, relative to the size of that animal, it's half the size of the animal. So it's far from infinitesimally small. He's added this huge disc around the animal so that when it drops, it slows down its descent so it doesn't smash. But what do you think would happen if he added an infinitesimally small wing stub to that animal? It would drop and it would smash the same as the one that didn't have it. And that's the fundamental problem in natural selection. So I'm not the only person that recognises that problem in natural selection. This was around when Darwin was alive. One of his fiercest opponents was a guy called George Jackson Mither, or Mither, I'm not entirely sure. And he wrote a book on the genesis of species, and he entitled the second chapter, I'll get there. The incompetency of natural selection to account for the incipient stages of useful structures. Incipient means the beginning, the start, the first. So what he's saying is, like I am about the wing stub demonstration, all right, if you add a massive wing stub, yeah, that's going to do something. That's going to give that animal an advantage so that it can pass on that mutation. But if you add an infinitesimally small mutation, the incipient stage, what Mither is arguing is that it wouldn't do anything. So one more way to explain that is, imagine, for example, I've got so much time here, this is crazy. Normally anyway, so I've got loads of time. Imagine, for example, humans haven't evolved arms. We've got this far, but we've got no arms, right? And I was going to make an argument for natural selection. Let's say, for argument's sake, me and Brent, we're going to be good friends, I know, because we've been talking on Zoom and we get on really well. But let's say we had no arms and it kicked off. You might put your money on Brent. I'd probably put my money on Brent, right? But if I had evolved, for argument's sake, half an arm up to my elbow, right? You might say, well, Brent, albeit he's got knife skills and whatever else, but he's going to have to hold that knife in his mouth now because he doesn't have any arms. But I've got an arm up to the elbow that I've evolved, right? So in that instance, you might go, I'll put my money on Ian now because he's got half an arm. Because with that half of an arm, I could make an argument. I could protect my face. I wouldn't hit you, Brent. This is just, this is just an idea. But I could whack you with my half arm with the elbow, right? I could do damage with half an arm. But again, it goes back to the video with the wing stub. Because we're not talking about a mutation that's half an arm, we're talking about a mutation that's like a skin tag on my shoulder. And you have to ask yourselves, and you can apply this same logic to anything, your eyes, your ears, any part of your anatomy, your heart, your lungs. We've got this situation where they just claim that natural selection can do anything. Oh, it can build anything, and it's built all of you, it's built peacocks, it's built dolphins and whatever else. But the reality is that, as I say, that those incipient stages, the first stages, a skin tag on my shoulder, that's not going to do anything to give me an advantage over Brent if it kicks off, is it? So you'd be putting your money back on Brent because all I've got is this little skin tag. And I'll say, well, I've got an arm evolving here, and you'd be like, yeah, but that's not going to do anything for you. So anyway, I've got 2 minutes left, but I don't need them, so I'm just going to think I don't know. I must have missed like half the slides because normally when I practice it, I have to go 100 miles an hour just to get it inside 15 minutes. So I'll just pass it over to Brent.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, can you hear me okay? Testing, testing. So yeah, the process of evolution, the topic of do we have an intelligent designer? Is it a case of evolution? It's one of the oldest questions that has been up for debate. And for that, I guess it's a good, in terms of it's a question of the beginnings. So let's go back to the beginning. And the beginning of everything is the Big Bang. Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Do you want this one, Brent? Try that. I'll take that. Swap on.
Can you hear me okay now?
Better, yeah.
There we go. Yes, so we have to look at the Big Bang as the beginning of everything. And a lot of creationists will tell you that how can something come from nothing? The Big Bang, it's just a theory. But it's actual scientific fact, and I'll explain to you why. So the universe is 13.8 billion years old, and it began with the Big Bang, but despite what creationists might claim that it came from nothing, which how can something come from nothing, it actually came from something called a singularity, where the beginning matter and ingredients that formed everything was all contained within this singularity. And then we had a vast explosion that created the universe. And we know the universe and the Big Bang happened because we can see it. So there's a couple of constants in the universe, so laws of physics, and things like light, for example. The speed of light is 186,000 miles per second. That's a constant that can be measured, and if you were to look at some sort of celestial object from the beginnings of the Big Bang, the light that we're seeing now was present shortly after the Big Bang, and we can actually see this now almost at the point of after the Big Bang. For the first 380,000 years of the universe, we can't see anything at all. It was too hot and too dense for light to pass through, and too hot for atoms to form. But after that 380,000 years, when light could travel, that's the light that we can see. It was discovered in the 1960s. It's called the cosmic microwave background radiation, and that is light. It now exists as a wave, but that is light that was very close after the Big Bang. We can see it. It's demonstrable. It's measurable. So it's something that is scientific fact. And there's also been for the solar system is about 4.5 billion years old, and the beginnings of life in evolution about 3.8 billion years old. These again are things that can be measured and proven as scientific fact. One of the things you did mention was about how things just spontaneously existed and where did things come from. But in the Big Bang we had the initial building blocks, and then in the dying photo clouds and in dying stars we get a lot of the other materials, cobalt, iron, nickel. They are created. And these are the things that, when it comes to evolution, these are the building blocks that add to evolution. But talking about the Big Bang, there's one question you have to ask yourself: and that's well, where did God come from? And if God existed and everything has a creator, who created God? If God's infinite, then surely that must mean the universe is also infinite. So why for the need for God? There's no explanation, no need for God in a unlimited universe. So brief quick rundown of evolutionary timeline. Earth 4.5 billion years old. The first common ancestor about 3.8 billion years old. And something that Ian had mentioned earlier was about common ancestors and how can there be one fish or one species that was a common ancestor of everything. But there's something known as LUCA, L-U-C-K, which is the last universal common ancestor, and there are things that we actually do know. We do have a last common ancestor from about 3.8 billion years old. And about 4.1 to 3.8 billion years ago, heavy bombardment into our solar system from meteorites, asteroids, things like that, which added the hydrothermal activity of that and a lot of the ingredients that were placed upon the Earth all give us this sort of framework, this background for given life on Earth. And one thing that's actually worth mentioning is that 99% of all life on Earth and the universe itself is made up of 6 atoms. Hydrogen, helium, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen and neon. And you can actually recreate the process of evolution and spontaneous evolution, life coming when life didn't exist before. It's actually been done in labs. You can actually recreate the same conditions. It actually has been done already in labs to create life when life didn't exist before. We've done it in labs, and if we can do that in labs, then what's the need for a intelligent creator? Why couldn't it happen if all those building blocks, ingredients were already present naturally? We can also prove that evolution is true through other scientific methods such as radiocarbon dating and radiometric dating, which applies to fossils. So for radiocarbon dating, it's a method of determining the age of something that has organic materials in that. So the way that happens is radioactive carbon interacts with the cosmic rays and nitrogen in the atmosphere. We end up with this radiocarbons that is taken in by plants through photosynthesis. It then gets into animals and plants, goes right through the chain. But there's radiocarbon is an isotope of carbon. An isotope is simply something that has on the periodic table, same chemical compound, but it's difference in the amount of neutrons in the nuclei. That's all that an isotope is. But by measuring radiocarbon, isotope of carbon, we can actually look at the rate of decay and measure that in an organism to actually find out its age. That's radiocarbon dating. Radiometric dating, similar sort of process, but looking at fossils and rocks associated with the fossils. So isotopes, they actually decay at a constant rate. So if you were to take a fossil and look at the ratio between the parent isotope and the daughter isotope that's been created, if you look at the ratio, you can actually determine the age of a fossil using this process. And that's why we can actually scientifically show that fossils, things like that, millions and millions of years old, which is something that a lot of, I'm not saying this is something Ian believes, but a lot of creationist intelligent designers buy into the whole, the Earth is only a few thousand years old, things like that. But we can actually show the existence of the universe and these fossils millions of years old, and gives more credence to the process of evolution. You can also look at more evidence for evolution is looking at the fossil record, and we have in museums and universities all around the world, we've got millions and millions of fossils, and you can build up a picture of how life has evolved and changed from one species to another by looking at the fossil record. And the fossil record itself, you can look at, if you just take like a subsection of looking at the strata of, say, like the soil and the different rock layers. If you look at the different strata layers, you can actually, and with the fossils present, some fossils and some species only exist in certain climates and certain situations. So by looking at the strata, plate tectonics, and how things have moved over time, it's more evidence that we know these processes do exist. And how much time do I have left there, sorry?
I started after you started. You're at nearly 9 minutes, and I think you've been going for a couple. So I think you've got maybe another 5. I'm not sure if
Cool.
that is there.
Yeah. So in terms of the actual process of evolution, cells replicate either by mitosis or meiosis. Most of them will replicate by mitosis, when the DNA will unzip and will split, and the cell replicates and creates a copy of itself. Meiosis is a similar sort of process, but instead you're looking at the unzipping of each strand of a gamete or the sex cells, and you'll get half of the chromosomes from your mother, half from your father. And it's this process of meiosis that is how species evolve, with getting a genetic difference, half from your mother, half from your father. But with each new generation, you also get differences, because on your DNA, on your chromosomes, you've got something known as an allele, which is a variation of nucleotides on your chromosome. And it's these variations, these alleles, that with each replication and with each mutation, it allows for these differences. So whether we're looking at the evolution of the eye or whatever it might be, all these changes come about through these mutations and whatever alleles attached to certain points on the chromosome. And it's through that we get all this genetic differences. And natural selection, I'm sure you're familiar with the term natural selection and survival of the fittest. So when you've got these differences, these variations that have come about through a few mutations, if a particular mutation or a new limb or a way to do things provides a evolutionary advantage, then that animal has a greater chance of passing on its genes through surviving. So survival of the fittest is not about the strongest or the smartest. It's the most adaptable to change. So by having these advantages is how we get over time. As they continue to exist within this new species, because it confers that evolutionary advantage. It's how we get a new species over time with this particular new population that has a new ability or a new part of its biology. So that's how we do get all these changes through natural selection. And we also have genetic flaws as well. So one of the things that an intelligent designer or creationist might tell you is that it's perfect, it's so complex life, whether it be the human being or the eye itself, it's so complex that nature's perfect, but there's all sorts of hereditary diseases and genetic flaws that exist within us. So if there's an intelligent designer, a creator, how can we have all these genetic flaws, hereditary diseases? How can these things exist when we have an intelligent designer? So we have as well not only these genetic flaws, but we also have various junk DNA. Not every gene or gene in on our DNA strand has a particular function. There's lots of junk DNA that serves no purpose. So again, if we've got an intelligent designer, a creator that has sat down, as you were, and created all life on Earth, why do we have these bits of junk DNA that serve no purpose? So that's something that I will, when it comes down to the questions at the end, that's something I'll offer up to Ian to perhaps explain how we have junk DNA when if we have an intelligent designer. And I'm not sure how much time I have left, but do I throw it back over or how long? 15, yeah. So I'll pass it back over to Ian, but when we on my next section, I'm going to talk about a few problems with the intelligent design argument.
Okay, so I'm going to start straight off with a quote from Richard Dawkins, just to emphasise how we see design in nature, and Dawkins is acknowledging that. So, it's almost too wonderful to believe that the laws of physics working through this very remarkable process that Darwin called natural selection has produced these gigantic collections of apparently purposeful beings which look overwhelmingly as though they had been designed. They carry a terrific illusion of design which fooled humanity until the middle of the 19th century. So what Dawkins is essentially saying, that although it looks overwhelmingly like a duck and that it quacks like a duck, that it's definitely not a duck. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about DNA and how we see design in DNA. So just quickly in case anyone doesn't know too much about DNA, it was recognised in the 1950s that DNA behaves like computer code. So computer code works with zeros and ones, and the sequence of the zeros and ones is what conveys the information. Likewise, in DNA, rather than zeros and ones, we have what are called nucleotide bases, and there are 4. They labelled them A, T, C and G, and it was recognised in the 1950s by a guy called James Crick, I believe, I might have got his first name wrong, that the sequence of the nucleotide bases was what was conveying the information to build the proteins that build you and keep you alive. So computer code is information, DNA is information, and try and come up with one source of information that hasn't originated from a mind. We know it intuitively that information always comes from a mind, whether it's a paragraph in a book, a message in a bottle, or a road sign. We know that information always originates from a mind. You'll never have a book that writes itself. So this is a quote from Bill Gates, not a friend of mine. DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created. Is Bill Gates. And then a quote from Richard Dawkins, so the man himself again: the machine code to the genes is uncannily computer-like, but it's still not a duck. So I'm going to try and explain it like this. I don't know if you can see the screen, but remember back in the day we used to have that, it's still popular now, Tetris. I used to have it on my mobile phone, a very simple computer program, a very simple game. Brilliant game, but very simple. Simple code for a game like Tetris. But I grew up playing a game called Street Fighter, much more complex game, right? So you've got different characters, you've got different locations, you've got different moves. So the coding involved in Street Fighter, is much more advanced. Now, if I told you that and I'm not a computer programmer, I don't know if we have any here, but you don't need to be one to know that if we just start randomly switching up the zeros and ones in the coding that builds Tetris, we're going to degrade Tetris and eventually break Tetris to the point that it's no longer usable. We know intuitively that switching up the zeros and ones randomly in the coding of Tetris is never going to randomly create a game as complex as Street Fighter. So we understand that intuitively. So if we were to compare Tetris to a simple creature like a worm, and then compare Street Fighter to a more beautiful and complex creature like a peacock, if we intuitively understand that randomly switching up the zeros and ones in Tetris could never create Street Fighter, why would we believe that randomly changing the bases in your DNA, which behave like the zeros and ones in computer code, why would we believe that randomly changing those bases could ever eventually create a peacock or us or a rabbit or any animal? Like it's just counterintuitive to believe it. So moving on, this is going to be difficult to wrap your heads around. It's taken me a couple of years, so just try and stay with me. Many mathematicians for decades and decades have argued that Darwinism and the idea of mutations creating new limbs, new body plans, new species or us is mathematically impossible. So to try and I'm not a mathematician, but I'll do my best to try and explain why it's mathematically impossible. I don't know if you can see it, but on the left we've got a padlock, and the padlock has 4 dials, and on each dial you have 10 options. And that would give you 10,000 possible combinations on a padlock, which is why a padlock works. So you can lock up your bike and the chances of someone randomly getting the right combination are very slim. If you was to take a padlock with 10 dials, that would equate to 10 billion possible combinations. So let's say, for example, you've got a padlock with 10 billion possible combinations, and your friend happened to open up that padlock on the first attempt, you'd be warranted with knowing that your friend almost certainly must have found out what your combination was. The chances of doing it, the possibilities of getting it by chance are near impossible. You could spend your entire life going through the possible sequences, and with 10 billion to choose from, the likelihood is that you'd never be able to open up that padlock. So your DNA, the genes in your DNA code for the proteins that perform the functions in your body. So I need to explain a little bit about how that works. You have a machine that will run along your DNA and take a copy called mRNA, messenger RNA. It spits out that copy. This is all happening by chance, remember. It spits out this copy of your DNA, and that copy floats away to another machine inside your cell. These are literal machines. I'll talk about it in a minute. It floats away to another machine called a polymerase. It wraps itself around the copy of your DNA, the RNA copy. It reads that RNA copy, and then it builds a chain of amino acids. So at the bottom you can actually see it fairly well now. At the bottom you can see a chain which is representing amino acids. Now, unlike the bike lock, where at each dial you've got 10 options, a chain of amino acids has 20 options. There are 20 different amino acids, and your DNA has the information to build a chain and know the sequence that the amino acids needs to be in. And that amino acid chain, when it's complete, will fold up, again all by accident, fold up into a complex machine or part of a machine, protein machine, that will perform tasks inside your cell. So the problem is, we understand why it's absolutely impossible that your friend would ever get into that 10 dial lock unless they found the code on your phone or a scrap of paper. A chain of 150 amino acids is a small chain. They can be up to 2,000 amino acids long, right? So remember, 10 billion possible combinations for your bike clock with 10 options at each dial. a chain of 150 amino acids, this is the number that you would get. It's 10 to the power of 195 possible combinations, because you've got 20 options at each of the 150 sites along the chain. So this is the argument why it's mathematically impossible, because they're asking you to believe that random mutations, randomly, could build a chain, complete and correct, that will fold into a functioning protein. Now, unlike the bite clock, this number, which is to put this number into context, physicists will tell you that is vastly bigger, that number, than the estimated number of atoms that exist in the entire universe. That's how big this number is, much bigger than the supposed number of atoms in the entire universe. Now, the number comes down because there's not just, unlike the bite clock, there's only one sequence that will open the bite clock. There are numerous possible sequences of the chain that scientists now know can fold into a protein part. So not just one, but others, which brings this number down of the possibility of getting the... It's like having a bite clock with numerous different possible combinations that will open it rather than just one. So the number comes down to 10 to the power of 77 possible combinations. So one correct sequence for every 10 to the 77 incorrect sequences. Now you might look at that and go, well, that's almost half the size of the other number, so maybe it is possible. Well, no, to put this number into context, physicists will tell you that this is greater than the potential, the estimated number of atoms in the entire Milky Way. So it's still an I'm not going to be able to use that word, I'll think of another word. It's still a massive number, right? So massive that it's completely improbable that a random process could build a chain of amino acids 150 long. Now remember that last number, that's on a small amino acid chain, 150 amino acids long. If we was to calculate the number for a chain of amino acids that was 2,000 long, which is how long they can be, I wouldn't get the zeros on the screen. So it just wasn't worth it. So I had to pick a small one to emphasise how improbable it is. So, one last thing. So that's your potential of winning the national lottery. Just again, to look at the difference in the numbers. You've got one chance out of 45 million. Look at the difference in the numbers. It makes winning the lottery seem easy, doesn't it? Maybe go and get a ticket. So, I talked about the amino acids folding into machines. This is the most famous machine that exists. You can't see it, unfortunately. It's called a bacterial flagellum. It was made famous by a guy called Michael Behe in 1966. He wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box. The bacterial flagellum, to all intents and purposes, behaves like an outboard motor on a boat, and it's how bacteria get around your cell to perform the jobs that they're doing. How they know what jobs to do and when to do them. Like again, that apparently all works itself out by accident. But they don't swim, they have what's called a bacterial flagellum that behaves like an outboard motor on a boat. I'm no mechanic or an engineer, but engineers and mechanics recognise the parts so basically it has 40 protein parts, and they include a rotor, a stator, a drive shaft, a U-joint, bushings, bearings, and a tail-like propeller, which is what propels it through the cell. Those parts, we recognise the name of those parts, drive shaft, U-joint, bushings. These are design things that have been discovered inside the cell, performing those same functions. So for this machine to be built, remember your amino acid chain that has to be built by your DNA, and then it folds up into a protein part. This machine is made up of 40 protein parts. So that's 40 separate chains, all working itself out by accident. The chain gets spat out, folds up into a part, joins the other 40 parts to make a machine that will propel bacteria around the cell like an outboard motor. One of the most significant problems with this machine is that it's what's called irreducibly complex. To explain irreducible complexity, you're looking at a very simple mousetrap. It's got 5 parts. You cannot reduce it. If you remove any one of the 5 parts of a mousetrap, it no longer works. It will not catch a mouse. So it's irreducibly complex. Your mobile phones, you can take the torch out, it still works as a mobile phone. It's not irreducibly complex. But the mousetrap is irreducibly complex. You can't remove any of the parts. Exactly the same as the bacterial flagellum. It requires all 40 parts to function without any one of they know this, scientists, this is not people on my side that are arguing this is secular atheistic scientists that recognise that this machine will not work unless it has all 40 parts complete together performing this one function that it does. Now, so then you have to ask yourself, well, how did that randomly evolve bit by bit when you need all the parts together at the same time? So that's a problem that still, since 1966, no one has been able to respond to that argument without a straw man. They'll basically say, well, the mousetrap, you can remove a couple of parts and use the rest of it as a tie clip. Yeah, you can, but a tie clip isn't going to catch a mouse. The point of irreducible complexity is that if you reduce it, if you remove a part, it won't perform its function. The bacteria needs this machine to get around the cell doing its job. So the arguments against irreducible complexity don't stand up. So Brent mentioned junk DNA. This is a quote from Richard Dawkins. So quickly, junk DNA, they sequenced the human genome in 2000, and at that point they learned that only 2% of your DNA contains the information, the genes that build the proteins like that machine we just saw, and the amino acid chains. And Richard Dawkins and various other evolutionists jumped on it, which is what they tend to do. Look into it, you'll see they do this a lot. They jumped on it and assumed that the 98% didn't do anything, and therefore they called it junk DNA or pseudogenes. So this is Richard Dawkins in 2009 talking about that. He says, and even pseudogenes that don't do anything but are vestigial relics of genes that once did something, I find it extremely hard to imagine how any creationist who actually bothered to listen to that could possibly doubt the fact of evolution. And then it gets quite animated. But they don't listen, he says. So he's basically saying 98% of your DNA is junk, doesn't do anything, and because it doesn't do anything, it proves evolution, right? Because he's saying it's relics of your past, because you used to be a fish, and then after you was a fish, you were something else, and eventually you became a monkey, and now you're a human. And he's saying that's just information that used to build your gills and your flippers when you was a fish, and then your tail when you was a monkey, but now we don't need that, it builds your... So that's the argument, that's why he's saying that you've got all this useless information that's still there. Now, it was really embarrassing for Richard Dawkins, but he took it quite well. In 2012, he was on stage with a rabbi. You can find this video on YouTube if you just Google Richard Dawkins junk DNA. And the rabbi explained to Richard Dawkins, which Dawkins already knew about, that just a couple of weeks before this talk they had on stage, finally papers have been published where they recognised that the 98% of DNA that was supposedly junk is not junk. And they recognise now that it doesn't code for your proteins that perform the jobs inside your cells, but it's doing other jobs which they're still learning, they're still trying to recognise exactly what it does, but now they know it's not complete junk. So this was Dawkins' opportunity to put his hands up and say, well, as a scientist, he's always saying as a scientist, we love it when we're proven wrong, because that's how science moves forward, and that's how we can show that we're scientific and that we're objective. So Dawkins responded, well, after being told that it's not junk DNA and you've been ramming that down people's throats for 10 years, Dawkins responded, well, I've noticed that there are some creationists who are jumping on it because they think that's awkward for Darwinism. Quite the contrary, of course. It's exactly what a Darwinist would hope for, is to find usefulness in the living world. So he's gone from junk DNA is absolute proof for evolution, and if you doubt it, you're a moron, which is what he was more or less saying in his previous quote on stage, and now it's exactly what you would expect. It's proof of evolution. So either way, it's proof for evolution. This is how objective Richard Dawkins is. So it's definitely something you should question. So just to finish, I'm just over time, but it's like my last slide. Richard Dawkins currently is the world's most famous atheist. Before Richard Dawkins was a man called Antony Flew. Chances are you won't have heard of him, but Antony Flew was the world's most famous atheist in his time before Richard Dawkins. Travelled the world mocking Christians. I'm not Christian, by the way. I'm not religious. I believe in intelligent design. I'm technically what's called a deist, which means I believe there's a creator, but I don't subscribe to any particular religion. Anyway, Antony Flew, about 10 years before he died, said this. Biologists, bear in mind he spent his life, like Richard Dawkins, mocking people that believe in a creator, and like they're just completely foolish for believing so. But he's a bit more objective than Richard Dawkins. He said this: biologists' investigation of DNA has shown, by the almost unbelievable complexity of the arrangements to produce life, that intelligence must have been involved. The only satisfying explanation for the origin of such end-directed, self-replicating life as we see it on Earth is an infinitely intelligent mind. So 10 years before, and bear in mind, like me, he became a deist. He believed, based on the evidence and the unbelievable complexity that we've discovered now inside ourselves, the molecular machines, the DNA, and all of this stuff, he became a deist. This isn't someone that's 10 years, like, getting old and he thinks, well, I'm going to pretend I'm a Christian now and hopefully I'll get myself into heaven. Like, it's not someone that's doing it, you know, hedging his bets and saying, oh, I believe in God now because it's going to help him out once he's dead. He still rejected religion. He just accepted intelligent design based on the evidence. So he was essentially saying, it is a duck. You can't see it, but there's a duck there and it says it's a duck. So that's my time. Thanks. Cheers.
Thank you. So for my last segment, so when it comes to this debate in terms of evolution and against creationism, when you look at intelligent designers and creationists, there's some that will be in the camp that evolution is false, it doesn't exist whatsoever, there's no basis for evolution. But you also find some that will fall into the camp of, okay, fine, we accept evolution, we accept that science has proven evolution, and with some of these techniques like the radiocarbon dating, things like that I'd mentioned, it's scientifically proven that evolution does exist. So let's look at the creationists that might accept evolution, accept evolutionary facts, but say, okay, we'll accept that, but it was God that did it. It was some sort of intelligent designer that used evolution to create the variety of life on Earth. Well, for that, I'd draw back to the point of flaws and inefficiencies in biology, because if something is intelligently designed, it stands to reason that it wouldn't have defects or flaws if it is intelligently designed. So to dispel the whole idea of that, I'll look at a couple of flaws within biology. One is the laryngeal nerve. So the laryngeal nerve runs from the brain to your larynx, or your voice box. Voice box obviously responsible for speech and for controlling your breathing, and it's controlled by the laryngeal nerve. Now, as you'll be aware, the distance from your brain to your larynx is not that great, but the actual pathway that the laryngeal nerve takes, it goes from your brain into your torso and it loops around your heart and then back up to your larynx. And the reason why it is like this is because it actually supports evolution, is because one of our early ancestors was a fish. We started life in the oceans, life started in the oceans before it moved onto land about 1 billion years ago, I believe. And in fish, the pathway that the laryngeal nerve took, it went from the brain, it bypassed the heart, went straight to the gills. But then through the process of evolution, and when animals started to come onto land and necks would elongate and the heart would travel further south and sit further lower into the torso, due to that, the laryngeal nerve stayed in its original pathway, but then elongated through the process of evolution. But if we had an intelligent designer, why would they choose to have the laryngeal nerve go from your brain down into your torso, loops around your heart, back up to the larynx, when it could have just been a very short, simple, direct route? So the fact that we have this inefficiency with the laryngeal nerve is evidence to support evolution, and evidence to show that how can we have such an inefficiency in nature if it was intelligently designed. And something that was also brought up was complexity. And I know a lot of intelligent designers and creationists will tell you that life is so complex. Look at the human eye for example. It's so complex. How could something just evolve such complexity? How could something just completely spring up and then we have these complex components and animals, things like that? But what creationists and intelligent designers are failing to take into account with that is the huge expanse of time that is taken for the evolutionary process. It's believed that it's about 4 billion years that we've had life evolving on Earth. That's 4 billion years of evolution of small, minute changes. With each cell replication, with each new generation, we've got these incrementally small little changes over time, and we have a vast array of time for these small changes to produce such complexity over time. So if we look at the evolution of the eye, and we can actually see from the fossil records, we can actually see all these changes and species with different stages and the evolution of the eye. So the eye is actually a good example of the evolutionary process. And in the beginning, the earliest life forms, single-celled organisms, and even when we got to multicellular organisms, had no functioning eye. That was a later point in evolution. And it started with the evolution of photoreceptive cells. Photoreceptive proteins that could discern light. And in the beginning it was more simply for sort of synchronizing your circadian rhythms. But then these photoreceptor proteins formed into cells, and eventually by the Cambrian explosion you had this flat sort of eye patch of photosynthesis cells that could discern basic direction, things like that. And then as this sort of flat disc of these light-sensitive cells starts to kind of cup and turn into a bit of a ball, you then have light as it hits these cells at different angles. You can then discern the direction in which that light is coming. So if you're a prey or a predator, say if you're a prey species, and then you can now tell which direction light is coming from, perhaps that's a predator, so it gives you that evolutionary advantage that, okay, predators are coming from this direction, I need to go. And then eventually this sort of came around to this sort of shape. And we were able to focus light at the back of these cells, which formed the retina, and that gave a further evolutionary advantage that we can now kind of focus light, discern which direction it's coming from. Eventually, the cornea and the lens evolved, and we could then focus an actual image, and all these little changes have taken billions and billions of years, and it wasn't necessary for the eye to evolve suddenly overnight. And something also not only using the eye, but also you talked about junk DNA, and you are right in one of the things that you said, that they found some junk DNA. Later was discovered that it actually had a function. It wasn't junk DNA at all. But the majority of all junk DNA is actually pseudogenes. And pseudogenes, we actually do know quite a lot about them. And they are basically nucleotide sequences that resemble functioning genes but serve no particular function anymore. And there's a couple of reasons for this. It could be simply be frame shift, where there's been a deletion of an insertion of a nucleotide that has caused it to become defunct and doesn't exist anymore. But also you've got something called a stop codon. So when you've got proteins are being created through a process called translation, you've got something called a stop codon and a start codon, which basically decides and tells when to start making these protein sequences. But you can have a premature stop codon, which causes a gene not to function, become a pseudogene. And we actually know that most of these this junk DNA is pseudo genes. So when Ian was saying that junk DNA is actually, there's no such thing, well actually most of it's pseudogenes, and it supports the theory of evolution. This is something that we all know. So while I accept what he said, that some genes have, some junk DNA has a function that we've later discovered, when you said that this is perhaps something that of all junk DNA, that it does have things that we don't actually know, that's actually not true. How much time have I left?
Yeah, that's about right.
No, he's got more. I started just.
Because I only timed the first two lots because I didn't know you were going into the second part.
I think,
so
yeah,
you've got the time
I think
there.
you've got a good 3 or 4 minutes. Again, I forgot to start when you started, but you're at 9 minutes now, and I started a couple of minutes.
Yeah, a couple of minutes
so
left.
it takes on you.
Right, in the last couple of minutes that I've got, I'll just focus on a couple of things that you said. In terms of irreducible complexity, as an example of why evolution can't be true, with the bacterial flagellum, how if you take one small part away and it no longer functions, using, for example, the eye and the complexity of the eye, as I've already kind of explained, that evolution takes billions and billions of years to for these changes to exist. So the fact that you've got a complex thing like the eye, and if you were to remove one small part of it and it would no longer function, that is not an argument against evolution in support of an intelligent designer. That's just a part of the evolutionary process. So the fact that you've got irreducible complexity is not an argument for an intelligent designer, because yeah, you could take an eye and take a part of it away and it won't work anymore, but it took millions of years of absolute micro sort of changes over time to get to that point. So irreducible complexity isn't supporting the idea of an intelligent designer. Is that my 2 minutes?
He's got the time there.
So what's happening now? Do I get a few minutes to respond? Should we just do like?
Have you asked each other the questions? Have you done a question
I
part?
just presented my 15 minutes, but I do have some comments.
Yeah.
So what do you want to do? 5 minutes each? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'll do it, yeah.
Right, so just
We're
run
doing the
through.
Q&A.
Yeah, so if we do 5 minutes each,
Do
I'll
Q&A.
respond to some stuff, and then he can have 5 back if he wants
Right.
it, and then we can ask.
Okay, yeah.
Is that good? Okay, so just to comment on a few things that Brent had said there. So he talked about the evolution of the eye. You'll find videos of Richard Dawkins all over the internet talking about the evolution of the eye. And remember, I was talking earlier about the incipient stages of natural selection. So remember the skin tag on my shoulder that's useless. It's you know, you could say after millions of years that skin tag would grow into an arm, fine, but the skin tag on its own is completely useless. It's not going to do anything. And when Richard Dawkins talks about the evolution, so-called evolution of the eye, he always starts with this magic patch of light-sensitive cells. Well, you know, again, cells are infinitely more complex than anything humans have ever designed. So he just starts there. Oh, you've got a patch of light-sensitive cells, but that patch of light-sensitive cells, they don't have at that point, they don't have an optic nerve running back to a brain that can decode the information that they're supposedly sensing. So again, it's not science, it's just pure conjecture claiming that you can do this, natural selection can sort that out if you just start with a patch of light sensitive cells. And it's very similar to his wing explanation. If you just start with a huge mutation wing flap thing that he calls it, that enables the animal to fall but not die, then that could provide an advantage. But you have to remember that the mutations are always supposed to be infinitesimally small. If they weren't infinitesimally small, if they were huge, you'd see people at the beach and you'd go, oh, look at that guy's started evolving a flipper. But they're supposed to be infinitesimally small, at least small, right? So, that would be my comment on the eye. The thing with junk DNA, you might say that there's still some junk DNA now. I'm going to argue, no, it's still stuff that they're yet to understand. So you're all familiar with your appendix. Now, we've all grown up. We've had that rammed down our throats. Oh, your appendix doesn't work anymore. It's a vestigial organ. It's because you used to eat grass or something silly. I'm not sure if they're saying that we used to be cows. It wouldn't surprise me. But apparently your appendix has got something to do with grass and now it's useless. Well, this is what they used to believe. They didn't used to know or understand what your appendix was for. But it's now recognised that your appendix is like a very important part of your immune system. You can survive without it, but it's still a very important part of your immune system. And they also say that it has like a backup of bacteria. Let's say you had a really nasty case of the runs, right? And you cleaned yourself out and you lost all your good bacteria. They're saying that your appendix has this storage of good bacteria that can basically replenish your gut and sort you out. So it's evidence of really good design that evolutionists for years have been telling us at school, oh, that's proof that you have a vestigial organ from your past that you don't need anymore. You mentioned that there's no need for God. I personally prefer to use the word creator. I don't say God because it's loaded and whatever else. But saying that there's no need for God is almost like looking at a building and saying there's no need for a builder. There is a need for a builder. Without it, you don't get the building. And the comments that I've made and the stuff that I've talked about today, the fossil record and the massive diversity of life just appearing at the beginning of the fossil record, this isn't something that we should just be overlooking. This is something that evolutionists just overlook, because it suits them and their worldview. They don't believe there's a God, But the reality is that it is this massive contradiction to Darwinism. Darwin himself acknowledged that in The Origin of Species, but he hoped that in the years to come they would find the fossils below the Cambrian period that would explain how those animals got there. They've never been found. So you've got to imagine, for 150 years, people have been scouring the earth trying to find lesser animals, lesser fossil animals to explain the Cambrian animals. Because if you're the guy that finds those animals, you're set for life. It would be amazing. And we're talking about billions and billions of animals. If we were talking about them trying to find one fossil of one animal, I'd be happy to say, all right, fair enough, they've scoured the earth, but they're only looking for one animal. They might get it eventually, but we're talking about billions and billions and billions of animals that must have existed before the Cambrian animals appeared in the fossil record, and they've never been found. How probable is it that there's billions and billions of fossils below the Cambrian, but they still can't find them? What else? Sorry, bear with me, I've got notes, but...
Would you want me to get... No.
Yeah.
Not working yet. I'll wait for that, the mic is fine.
You're live now. I know you mentioned, I'd like you to elaborate on, you talked about how we created life in the lab, and there's an awful lot of stuff that is claimed, and when you look into it, it turns out that it's not strictly true, or not remotely true in most instances with evolution. But this idea that they've created life in the lab, I'd like to hear about that, because you didn't really elaborate on that. Yeah, I pretty much covered everything, I believe. You said something about the bacterial flagellum, but I can't quite remember what it was, so I can't comment on it. Anyway, yeah, I'll just stop there. Do you want to take this?
Best thing? Yeah.
I've got a mic for a minute. You want
Alright,
to
alright.
brother? You should be live there, but no, it should be live on that.
I'll just get that one, it's fine.
Let me take it on, see if I can work.
First, I'll just address what you said about a sudden formation of life in the Cambrian period of time, and that is an example and evidence for an intelligent designer, that there's a sudden burst of life. And while that is true, the notion that there was a sudden burst of life in the Cambrian period, there's a scientific explanation for why that was, without the need for an intelligent designer. And also, life didn't start there. So the Cambrian period, about 550 million years ago, but we've got about 4 billion years worth of evolution. So there's billions of years worth of evolution before we got to the actual Cambrian period. And in terms of why we had a sudden burst of life, there's various reasons for that. One is that the actual ozone layer formed about 600 million years ago, and with the advancement and the evolution of multicellular organisms that were able to produce oxygen. It started with microbial bacteria that were able to produce oxygen. This free oxygen in the atmosphere allowed the development of plants that could photosynthesize and add more abundance of oxygen in into the atmosphere. So you've got things like higher increases of oxygen, and these conditions that allowed for the sunburst of life. It's one of the reasons why dinosaurs were so big, is because higher ratios of oxygen in the atmosphere. So you actually had conditions for this Cambrian explosion that is explained through evolution, and it's not necessary to have an intelligent designer to explain the Cambrian explosion.
Can I comment? If that's the case, then if I was to go back to the quotes that I've got, you've got, and there's many more, there's dozens and dozens you could choose from. The Cambrian explosion was the most remarkable and puzzling event in the history of life. That was Stephen Jay Gould, arguably one of the world's most famous atheists. He's not alive now. Richard Dawkins himself saying it's as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. There's all these quotes and comments from people that are, I accept that they believe in evolution, but it's clearly a problem because Darwin himself acknowledged it was a problem, and he had what was called the artifact hypothesis, which was basically that the fossil record isn't fully, we haven't fully scoured the Earth yet, and down the road he hoped, because he continued to believe in evolution even though he acknowledged the fossil record completely contradicted it, he hoped that down the road they'd find those fossils. I'm saying that they haven't found those fossils. We're 150 years later. They found fossil formations that make the situation worse. There's the Burgess Shale in Canada, and there was a massive find in China where they had soft-bodied animals that they found in the strata there. In the Cambrian, it was just hard-bodied animals. So they suddenly had all these soft-bodied animals that they didn't know existed before because they weren't preserved in the Cambrian. So it went from being this a sizable explosion already to a massive explosion. But you're talking about most of the animal body plans that exist today appearing in the fossil record at the start in a time scale between 5 and 10 million years, which sounds like a massive amount of time. I accept that, but evolutionists would tell you that is a blink of an eye in evolutionary time, because you have to have this vast amount of time for these so-called random mutations to build us. So you have to have a random mutation appear in one animal, and then maybe 100,000 years later a descent of that animal gets another random mutation that lands on top of that one that's eventually going to build an arm. But they know that most mutations are what they call deleterious. Most mutations don't do anything useful. I don't know that they've got an example ever of a mutation doing something useful. So, I feel like you can listen. We agree on lots of different subjects. We established that when we was on Zoom, and you can go to one source and get a completely different skewed perspective of a field than if you go to another. And I feel what I've learned through intelligent design is I have to go to the intelligent designers to learn about the Cambrian explosion. These are the people that have taught me all this stuff that is being left out in the school books and in the media. I would argue it's being suppressed, and the people that are arguing for intelligent design are clearly being suppressed. Anyway, I know I'm waffling a little bit, sorry, Brent. Can I ask, what did you feel about the arm thing with a skin tag? So if like I said, if I've got half an arm, I've got half a chance of beating you in a scrap, even if you've got your knives, right? But if it is just a skin tag on my shoulder, presumably you'd accept that skin tag, that's not going to offer me a survival advantage in a situation.
Well, it's true that what you said, that most mutations are useless. I accept that is true. But that's not an argument for intelligent design or against evolution, because when you have survival of the fittest and natural selection, it's a case of every now and then some of these many mutations that we have, you'll have some that will confer an evolutionary advantage, maybe slightly faster or stronger, and it's these that allow that individual to pass on its genes and for that mutation to carry on. The fact that there's mutations that don't carry on or are useless isn't an argument against that. That's just the process of how natural selection works. And also you mentioned a couple of other things like gaps in the fossil record, and that's necessarily so because you need certain pressures and temperatures, lack of oxygen, certain conditions for fossils to form. Most of the time this will happen in perhaps a great flood, things like this. So we don't have every single individual animal that has ever existed, we don't have a record, like a fossil record of them. There's naturally gaps. When you've got, whether it be some sort of climate catastrophe or like a flood or something that's created the correct conditions for fossils to form. So what you have instead is you have a series of snapshots that build up a picture of evolution, and the fact that there's gaps is not an argument against evolution or that it's not true. Instead, look at it as if you've got a jigsaw piece of, let's just say, Big Ben. So if you've got all the pieces and you start to put these pieces of the jigsaw puzzle of Big Ben together, you don't need to put every piece in that puzzle to know what the picture is, and that picture is Big Ben. So you can very quickly see that, oh, it's Big Ben, even though you've not all put all the pieces into place. You get a similar thing with the fossil record. Naturally there's going to be gaps because of the way fossils are formed, but there's that much of a wealth of fossil record that we know this to exist and be scientific fact, regardless of the fact that we do have gaps in the fossil record.
Yeah, but it's not just about the gap. So if anyone wants resources or places to go to look into this stuff, so I know I haven't covered it well enough to convert anyone today, but hopefully I've planted a seed. It's not just about the gaps in the fossil record, it's the fact that the top paleontologists, Darwin, Dawkins, all these people acknowledging that animals continue all through the fossil record to appear fully formed, and that makes no sense. You know, I've got a skeleton that they're claiming my entire skeleton slowly evolved. If I appear in the fossil record fully formed like this, why wouldn't you have half of my skeleton appear in the fossil record? Why is it consistently that we see through the... So basically you've got the Cambrian, but there are other events like the Cambrian where animals just suddenly appear in the fossil record. There's one called Gobi, the Great Ordovician Biodiversity Event. It's the same scenario shortly after the Cambrian where bang, this burst of animal life, complex animal life. That's the biggest problem, that you've got this diversity. You're supposed to have gradualism. You're supposed to have a simple animal that slowly evolves and slowly grows, slowly gets limbs and all the bits and bobs that we've got. But like I mentioned earlier, we've got animals in the Cambrian with eyes. You've got trilobites, they know that these animals had compound eyes. So, you know, Dawkins and all these people will tell you, don't even question it, your eyes evolved, like that's been dealt with, your eyes evolved, natural selection. But they're not explaining, they're just completely skirting over the fact that eyes appear at the beginning of the fossil record. There's actually a brilliant video you'll find on YouTube of Dawkins with a creationist. Again, I'm not a creationist, I'm not saying they're 6,000 years old and all that kind of stuff, but he's on a show with this creationist, and he did your explanation for how maybe that's where you got it, I'm not sure, but how the eye supposedly evolved and it closed up and this, that and the other. And the creationist said to Dawkins, well, yeah, but what about trilobites? And Dawkins goes, well, yeah, trilobites, I mean, they had really good eyes, they were good eyes, they were compound eyes. And then moves on. Yeah, no, but the problem is that they're at the beginning. Like, it couldn't be clearer to me, personally, that they're telling me, oh yeah, your eyes, hundreds of millions of years, that can sort that out, that'll evolve. But they appear at the beginning of this fossil record with no precursors to these animals. So if you take the fossil record on face value, evolution can't be true. That's how I see it.
What was that, the lamp? What time was it?
When's question time?
Oh yeah, should we just... I'm happy.
You happy for question time? Do you want to do any more?
Yeah,
I have to take it to the end.
I'd love it if anyone had questions. I'd like that. But if Brent wants to talk more.
Yeah, if you want to talk more, and I'll do some Q&A.
yeah, of course. Well, even though I had like one or two more things to say, I could quite happily do that in like my closing statement.
Yeah.
So, I'm happy to do like the questions, and then I can my last 2 points I can kind of do my closing statement. I'm happy for that.
Do we have anybody with any questions? Hands up. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Do you want to just shout it out? We can hear from there.
yeah. I mean, so my question would be, like, a lot of what you say is based on science. Yeah, we haven't had science for hundreds of years. You know, science is corrupt, and if you follow the white papers, then obviously you're following just what the system wants you to spout out, really. So I think that you need to perhaps question the science, because when science can't be questioned, which it can't these days, then science doesn't exist, does it? You know, so I find a lot of your argument is based on perhaps false information that may be laid there, like schooling and stuff like that. This is just my personal, outtake for it. You know, so I think that perhaps we need to understand that maybe there are things out there that we don't understand, and all of these little things, because you don't know the truth for you. So none of us know the truth, but there are people who do know the truth, and instead of debating and arguing with each other, my take on it would be we should come together as a team and put the pressure on the people who are hiding the truth from us and extract the truth from them, is all I would have to say.
That's beautiful.
That was a very good question, actually. So in terms of when you're saying trust the science and there's a lot of corruption in science, I'll happily concede that. However, what I will say that science itself is not the problem. So there are various things from the laws of physics, and there's things that are measurable and demonstrable that we know is scientific facts. Like, for example, the speed of light that I mentioned, 186,000 miles per second. The fact that we know that we can measure the rate of travel for light, and we know that's how we can determine the age of the universe through experimentation and
I would say that it's all theory though, there's nothing that's being actually proved. So you keep using the word prove with science, but actually nothing's being proved, it's all theory. Even gravity is a theory.
Well, I'd say that's I'd respectfully disagree on that point. With the theory, I'll come back to the definition of theory, but to address your first question, that was in terms of science. We can't trust the science. One of the things I would use as an example is over the last few years with what's happened with all this COVID nonsense, and trust the science, and that is not an argument against science and the sort of the Socratic method of learning about our universe. That wasn't science. My point on that is it wasn't science. That was propaganda. That was from the media, from the government. That was propaganda and not science. There was plenty of medical professionals and doctors that weren't actually speaking out but were silenced. So to answer your first question, I'd say that science wasn't the problem. It was propaganda and corruption, which you rightly pointed out do exist, and I will agree with you on that. But that's not an argument against science. It's for when things are manipulated by power and money.
Which the constant know. So the information that you have is the information that's been given to you, by other people who are the tops of their professions, who are allowed to be in a public platform. And as we know, all public platforms have been controlled for how long? So when you're believing these people have been put there, like Edison said, Edison, he created the light bulb and stuff like that, but who did he get rid of for that? And what could we have had? We could have free energy, which is still available, it's still controlled. People are buying electricity and buying it. Elon Musk and Tesla, it's all, it's illusion that is there to distract and confuse us, and yet we pretend that, or we think that we know lots of stuff based upon this, and most of it, to be honest, is illusion. You said that you were going to touch upon the theory of gravity, so I can prove to you that we have had an anvil dropped into what's the thing in the thermometer, the heaviest element, mercury, and it floats. So if there was gravity, the mercury would be on the bath, wouldn't it? It's density. So there's lots of things that don't align when you follow the white papers. If you look at the history before the 1700s, before things were changed, and how things were taught to us then, we were taught a completely different version of the world and how things are. So.
Can I just comment really quickly on your first? I don't know this guy, by the way, but the question was a great one. Evolutionary science is, I didn't have time to include it, right? But it's riddled with corruption. So there's a book written by a guy called Jonathan Wells, who's a biologist, and it's called Icons of Evolution. And he wrote another book 20 years later called Zombie Science, which was a follow-up to Icons of Evolution. And he covers 10 of the iconic proofs for evolution that have already literally actually been proven to be false or so highly flawed they've got no basis or no place being in a children's textbook. And one of the most famous is what's called Haeckel's embryos. And this was Darwin's favourite proof. So the guy that's telling us that we've evolved from monkeys, his favourite proof was that his friend Haeckel had what are called Haeckel's embryos. He did these drawings of the embryos of various animals in their early stages. And they said, look, these embryos, even though these animals are completely different from one another, these embryos, they all look the same. And that's because we've all evolved from the same fish or the same slug or whatever it is. But it was proven in the 1800s that Haeckel's embryos were fudged. So they can look at the actual embryos of the animals that he was talking about today and see they're not the same at all. But this, Haeckel's embryos, this is why this guy wrote the book Icons of Evolution, this and all these other fraudulent claims for evolution still exist in the textbooks. My nephews and nieces will be reading this stuff in the textbooks probably still now. So the question is, why is all this stuff that's been blatantly proven false, why is it still in the textbooks? And I would say because if you take it out in the textbooks, there's nothing left in the textbooks to convince us when we're young and impressionable that we've evolved from sea slugs or fish. Or whatever.
Our next question.
Well,
Would you like to ask the next
sorry,
question?
sorry, can I very quickly just there was one point I didn't address from this gentleman.
Alright.
If you-
Okay.
Sorry, yeah. Just you mentioned about theory. So just a very quick point on that before we move on, and that there's the word theory that we use every day. That it's a guess, it's a wild guess that we don't know, but there's a difference in the definition of what a layperson might term theory and then a scientific theory. So the fact that it's got theory in the description doesn't mean that it's just a theory.
It means that it's unproven.
So what a scientific theory is where we'll have hypothesis, we'll have things that we want to understand, we'll make various experimentation, we'll build up a body of evidence that supports the claim. So the fact that it's called evolutionary theory or the theory of gravity doesn't mean it's just a wild theory that we don't have any evidence for, because a scientific theory is different from a theory that like a layperson might use in normal conversation. So I just wanted to sort of like clarify that before we moved on.
We've only got 5 minutes, and there's a lady over there and there that had questions. Should we try and get through them in 5 minutes?
Yeah. Oh, give this lady a chance.
It's not so much of a question, just a sort of comeback, if that's okay. And first of all, I think science is probably the wrong word to use, because when we think of science, we think of big pharma and the allopathic medicine and things like that. What we're talking about here is biology, and ology is the study of living things, study of living things. When we take a walk in nature, we're doing that. We're looking at how things grow. We can see things happening, and there's experiments you can do yourself. You can put a plant in water and see transpiration, happening in front of your eyes. So yes, it's written in the books, and some of it we can't do at home and prove, but we can see some of the basic stuff. You can look through a microscope and you can see the basic biology or science.
Are you talking the evolution of it though?
So yeah, I'm just going to come on to a few points about that.
Go on.
So when you started, you said that we would need life form would start with a simple bit of DNA. And how does that happen randomly? Surely that just can't occur. But DNA is made up of like the base pairs that you mentioned, and then a ribose sugar and a phosphate.
Right.
Now ribose sugar, that is a simple monosaccharide, which we see being produced in nature all the time. Every time photosynthesis happens, we produce a monosaccharide, and we consume them.
Right.
So that can come around really easily. Phosphates attach to things all the time. In our bodies, the people in this marquee at the moment, there's probably hundreds of thousands of phosphates attaching and detaching from things. That's how things happen. For us to respire, we have to have that. They are the basis of oxidation and reduction. So this will occur very quickly, very naturally. And so for a piece of DNA to occur naturally, it's actually much easier.
But DNA is information, so you're arguing that the genetics that came about for evolution to get started, you're saying that comes about quite easily. DNA it's information.
Yeah.
It's not just random sequence of base pairs. The way they're sequenced is conveying the information.
So that's a little bit of like your number, huge number that you had on the screen.
Yeah.
Which I think is really interesting, and it's a way of putting something that's super complicated into a really simple form, which is hard to do. And you gave a good analogy to kind of show that. However, if we were going to do, I'm just going to do a slightly different analogy. If we were going to do the chemical reactions that we need to, just standing up here for 1 second, we would need to do hundreds of chemical reactions. And if we allowed them to happen naturally, they would take so long that we'd be dead by the time those happen for us to stand here for 1 second. So we have things called enzymes in the body, which speed up a reaction. like a biological catalyst. And without them, we'd be dead.
Yeah.
So in the same way, yes, that code is super complex. But if we have things like enzymes that are going to speed that process up, then it can happen.
Yeah, and
it's a little bit like
where the
artificial
enzymes
intelligence.
come from? It's all. Are you familiar with the name Stephen Meyer?
Yeah, I've heard of it.
Do you know who he is or what he does? Right, so all I'm going to say is that you know your biology, I accept that, right? You know your stuff, probably more than me, right? But the people that are delivering what I'm delivering today on intelligent design, they're going to give you a completely different perspective on this that you're not going to get from mainstream scientific sources. You're just not going to get it because they have worldviews. This is why we have this situation where I didn't want to bring up other subjects, but 9/11, you'll find that the vast majority of architects and engineers will tell you it's perfectly normal for buildings just to collapse at free fall speed. Yeah, it happens all the time. You know, I'm saying that you've got to go to my side. I think Brent would need to do the same too, to get a different perspective on it. And I think from the intelligent design perspective, they're the people that are telling me there's all this fraud in evolution, and it's true. Like, it's true. It's just there's just so much of it over and over again.
I actually will go and look into that now because
Yeah,
I want someone
good.
to like.
This is great. This is great. I'll give you the resources.
But
it's great.
it's just that the analogies you used, I was like, no, that's not right. Because even when you use the bacterium, the flagellum, bacteria produce so rapidly. Like in a tin of kombucha, you're talking about billions of bacteria. So if you think of like, you know, you leave some milk out on the side overnight and then there's billions of bacteria the next morning, if we take the mouse trap, one of them's going to have one part, it's not going to survive. One's going to have two parts, it's not going to survive. One of them's going to have 5 parts, that's the one that survives.
Yeah, but you're talking about something just accidentally having 5 functioning parts that work together.
Not accidentally, by mutation, and they've shown
yeah,
that mutations work.
No, they haven't, because then you're just saying that you're arguing that mutation can just mutate multifunctional parts that all come together to serve a purpose, like the bacterial flagellum. If you take the
analogy of your arm...
Yeah, which I think is a good one.
Well, I think it's not a good one.
No, tell us why.
For example, because if, you and Brent are about to have a fight, you've got no arms, okay?
Right,
that was
right.
the basis of this, right? Yeah. So you're going to both lose, okay? Some other guy walks in, he's got one neuron that's developed a bit better than yours, okay? And he's just a little bit smarter, and he does something like, I don't know, headbutts you, or maybe just runs away.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the tiny little advantage.
Yeah, but you're agreeing with me then, because what I'm saying is that's
useless. That's a useless mutation.
That's my point.
That other one is a good mutation.
Yeah, hold tight. That's my point. That's a useless mutation. So what I'm saying is, I'm the one. I've got no arm. I'm the one that's about to start evolving the arms that we're all using now, and it starts with this random tiny mutation, and people like Dawkins and Darwin will say that tiny mutation is eventually going to build my arm. It's because that tiny mutation is going to give me a survival advantage. I'm saying that tiny mutation has got to supersede all the advantages the other guys have got in here. So yeah, I might have the startings of an arm, this tiny mutation, but the guys in here might be faster, stronger, better looking, have all these advantages that supersede my little skin tag.
So you're actually trying to get proof of the arm, so it would be something a little bit more, for example, if you're talking about a fish, and the fish have got fins, and one fin might be slightly stronger.
Yeah.
It might be slightly different, and that fish might be able to use the stone in a certain way, which allows it to do something. It's really, really very subtle. You're trying to put it into a context that we understand.
Well,
it's so subtle.
Or the wing stub that Dawkins showed. He demonstrated the ball wouldn't smash, but if you gave it a infinitesimally small mutation, which is the argument, the glass bauble smashes the same as the first one, so it doesn't work. He's having to bypass the first mutation, the second mutation, and go to a point where you've got this massive mutation that would have built up progressively over hundreds. He has to start there to make the
But we
analogy
know
work.
that small increments do make a difference, because if you said, like, take the Olympics are on at the moment, you know, if we said we're going to round it up because we don't take into account those tiny differences, oh, they ran 100 metres in 10 seconds, oh, that person also ran 100 metres in 10 seconds.
Right.
Okay, it doesn't, you do want those tiny differences because they do make a difference. That's the difference between first place and second place.
Yeah, I disagree, but we can argue about this. Not argue about it, we can have a cuddle after, but we're done for time, but we should talk about this around the... Oh, that lady did have one question. Is it a big question?
First of all, after your debate, for me, the jury's still out. So there's a thing called epigenetics, which is actually starting to have some scientific weight behind it, whereas it was just considered like hocus pocus before. I think this junk DNA has got a lot going for it, actually. I think it is historical stuff that's stored for a rainy day. So when it's just like a little switch, it can just be switched on and off, it's just a little bit of methylation. And so when an arm is suddenly required, actually back in the day, there was an arm on an insect that was available, and that's just been switched off for a bit, but oh yeah, we're going to switch it back on now. And that is, so I suggest you both look at epigenetics and see how it is, but I also like to think, just because I'm a bit of a romantic, that actually a lot of pre-formed stuff that had been built over a much longer period of time was brought to this planet, but it's also had all this various bits of junk DNA or whatever. It had the ability to actually evolve, that this is an experiment just to see what happens. So like if Bill Gates suddenly put a load of stuff onto Mars and he, you know, had like an ark or something, eventually, maybe a few million years down the line, there might still be something, but it will have changed. But it was already formed when it was stuck onto Mars. So just saying, it could be, for me, the jury's out. There we go.
Yeah.
But anyway, look into epigenetics anyway.
Let me give you some resources for intelligent design. Just have a look at it. I'm not expecting to convert anyone, but have a look at it. It's interesting. It's really interesting. And you're going to end it, Tati.
Yeah. Has anybody actually changed their opinions on what they believe from this discussion? Everybody feels the same. Oh, well, nobody's minds have been changed. That's the end of Carry On Camping's Great Debate of 2024. Big thank you to our guests, Brent and Ian. I've been Patty Bow, and I will leave you with this famous quote by Aristotle: "The more you know, the more you realise you don't know."